Welcome back to Short Story Theatre. This is your host Basil Nightingale speaking to you from the little theatre in the alley just off Main Street. Today we are proud to bring you an award-winning suspense tale from the book Swamp Tales, written by our producer, Bill Russo. Our story is the bittersweet narrative of an unfortunate boy whose misshapen face made him look more like a fish than a person. His name was James Da Silva, but people just called him Catfish, or sometimes Jimmy Catfish. If Jimmy was odd, the place he lived in, called Codfresh Lake, was even more outlandish than the strange amphibious boy himself. More about that later. The book, Swamp Tales, was rated the number 5 best horror tale of 2018, on the website, freebooks.com, which sells bundles of books packaged together on television channels, such as Home Shopping and others. And Jimmy Catfish's tale is one of the top stories in Swamp Tales, which also contains The Cold Touch of Death and Death on a Rope, both of which have already been staged as audio dramas this season on Short Story Theatre. So without further ado, let's go to the stage, and I'm proud to announce the return of one of our favorite cast members, Gino Roselli. Gino's been on other projects, but he's back with us for the rest of Season 2. Gino is on stage now and is set to bring you to a well-hidden, secret place that does exist, but became almost inaccessible when the railroad tracks were pulled up many years ago, and the trains stopped running. Here's your narrator, Gino Roselli.
Welcome to Cape Cod. The island is just 64 miles long and it is located off the coast of Massachusetts, in New England. Unless you come by boat or airplane, the only way to get to Cape Cod is by car. You have to cross over one of 2 bridges that connect it to the mainland. Each bridge is rickety, old, and narrow, and about 1/2 mile long. Once you get onto Cape Cod, there are only 2 roads that span all 64 miles of the island, from the town of Bourne to the quirky village of Provincetown, at the end of the earth. If you drive halfway down the highway, it drops from 4 lanes to just 2, and you enter a nasty stretch of road called Suicide Alley. They call it Suicide Alley because of all the head-on collisions. Those crashes have claimed many lives of drivers and passengers in vehicles like the Ford Model T, back in the first years of the 1900s, and onwards, to occupants of the 2021 Ford Mustang. If you get off of Suicide Alley at the town line, separating the communities of Dennisport and Harwich, you will be less than 5 miles from the strangest body of water in all the world. But as Basil said, these days, the trains only go as far as Hyannis, the unofficial capital of Cape Cod. That makes it very difficult to get to that weird place called Codfresh Lake. You could walk there. That is, you could walk there if you could find an old-timer who knows the area. The wash ashores and the summer people have no idea how to get to the secluded lake, and they probably don't even know it exists. The trains used to go right by the lake, and there was a whistle stop where folks could flag down the Cape Cod Railroad's engine number 1. But nowadays, the only way that you could possibly get there is to follow me into this story. Be warned. Bad things happen to good people. If you're still willing, step off the beaten path and into the swamp. We're in the Bell's Neck Swamp right now, not far from Codfresh Lake, but before I take you there, I'm going to try to tell you what to expect. It is hardly possible to describe Codfresh Lake to you, so that you guys will get the picture of it in your head, as I have it in mine. Codfresh Lake. It is like no other body of water that anybody has ever seen. Some say it was created by the Great Hurricane of 1937. Others swear that it never was created at all, but is simply some sort of a cosmic joke. It is only called a lake because there is no word in English for what it really is. Though I certainly don't really know what it is, I can tell you how it came into being. In the middle of Cape Cod. Sometime in the early 1900s, from Nantucket Sound northwards, a saltwater river snaked its tidal way from the Nantucket Sound beaches of Dennisport towards the village of Brewster. The river, composed of salt water, was supposed to wander towards Brewster and outer Cape Cod, just as it had done for hundreds of years. But the river suddenly took a new path. It veered sharply west. At the same time, a rogue stream from Harwich, made up of fresh water, began a trip east at Long Pond, and grew much wider when it married a river from Hinckley's Pond. The expanding, conjoined rivers grew even larger by charging through Seymour Pond, about 3 miles from Route 6. Now powerful and as fast as a racehorse, the new, raging, freshwater river set a course for Dennisport. But it never got there. In an unlikely feat that only Mother Nature could accomplish, these strange rivers, one of salt and the other fresh, met each other headlong. The salt river rushed on to meet the fresh river combination. But the mingle of these entities did not bring forth a marriage of the headwaters. The mixing of the rivers was only an uneasy truce that created an odd body of water, 6 miles long and a half-mile wide. Divided into 3 sections, it consisted of a tiny sea of salt water 2 miles long on the east end, a small freshwater lake of 2 miles in length on the west end, and in the middle, between the freshwater lake and the saltwater lake, was a 2-mile lake of unearthly brackish water that the locals simply called the Brack. The 3 sections of the Codfresh Lake were as different in color as in composition. The salty part was a bright, inviting blue, while at the opposite end of the 6 miles the freshwater section had a brownish-black hue. In the middle, the Brack took on the gray pall of a World War II battleship. Airplanes from the Provincetown airport generally avoided Codfresh Lake. Some pilots reported feeling queasy as they flew over the motley waters. Other flyers said their engines sputtered when they crossed over the Brack. 30-pound codfish were known to swim in the salt waters of the east, and 12-pound trout basked near the western shore. But in the middle, the Brack, it was said that strange fish existed, fish that were neither salt nor fresh. They were simply called brackfish. The 6 miles of land that was filled by the uneasy entrenchment of the salt and fresh rivers contained both high points and low. It was both forested and bare, as well as rocky and sandy. As it was being formed during the wrestling match of the rivers, the Codfresh waters took down trees, hills, and hollows. The result was the largest lake on the island of Cape Cod, lying mostly in Harwich, but partly in Dennis. Oddly enough, the shape of the lake mirrored the shape of Cape Cod. It looked like a flexed, human arm. During the run of the railroad, Codfresh Lake was accessible. The train tracks ran right by it. After train service was stopped in the 1940s, the body of water could only be reached on foot. The nearest paved road was more than 3 miles distant. That is the reason you guys never heard of it. Few tourists, or even summer residents, have ever seen or heard of the Codfresh Lake. There was neither electricity nor municipal services in the area, and very few homes. Codfresh Lake is, and has always been, a lake of mystery. In places is bottomless. Other places it is a graveyard to the skeletons of the pine trees that went down when the earth sank. The pine trees are dead, but they still stand upright, so that if the sun shines from the right quarter and the water is less muddy than usual, a man, peering face downward into its depths, sees, or thinks he sees, down below him, the bare top limbs stretching up like the fingers of drowned men, all coated with the mud and green slime of many years. In still other places the lake is shallow for long stretches, no deeper than chest high, but dangerous because of the weed growths and the sunken drifts which entangle a swimmer's legs. The banks of Codfresh are mainly mud. Its west waters are also muddy, being a rich coffee color in the spring and a coppery yellow in the summer. The trees along its shore are mud-colored too, right up to their lower limbs after the spring floods, when the dried sediment covers their trunks with a thick, scruffy-looking coat. There are stretches of unbroken forest around it, and places where the rangy pines rise like tombstones above the dead trunks that rot in the soft ooze. There are long, dismal flats where in the spring, the leopard frogs spawn cling like patches of white mucus among the weed stalks, and at night the turtles crawl out to lay batches of perfectly round, white eggs, with tough, rubbery shells in the sand. Codfresh lies there, flat in the bottoms, freezing over in the winter, steaming torridly in the summer, swollen in the spring when the woods have turned a vivid green, and the flies and gnats, by the millions, fill the flooded hollows with their pestilential buzzing, and in the fall, ringed about gloriously with all the colors which the first frost brings. Gold of maple, yellow russet of oak, and the red of the burning bush. The countryside around Codfresh Lake is the best game and fish country, natural or artificial, that is left in Massachusetts, Connecticut or Rhode Island today. In their appointed seasons, the duck and the geese flock in by the thousands. Snow-white swans glide on the fresh water to the west, while seagulls patrol the east. Strange birds fly into the brack. Wild turkeys range the ridges. By night the bullfrogs, inconceivably big and tremendously vocal, bellow onto the banks. It is a wonderful place for fishing. Fluke and blues abound in the east, and there are trout and huge pickerel in the west. In the brack there are odd and crusty creatures, some too horrible to imagine. On every stranded log, the huge snapping turtles lie on sunny days, in groups of 4 and 6, baking their shells in the sun, with their little snaky heads raised watchfully, ready to slip noiselessly off at the first sound of oars grating in the oar locks. But the biggest creatures in Codfresh Lake are the catfish in the brack. Found only in the lake's gray waters, they are a kind of catfish seen nowhere else. Their ferocity is unmatched by any fish or mammal, with the exception of the Homo sapiens. They are monstrous creatures, these catfish. They are scaleless, slick things, with dead eyes, and poisonous fins like javelins, and huge whiskers dangling from the sides of their cavernous heads. 3 and 4 feet long they grow to be, and weigh 50 pounds or more, and they have mouths wide enough to take in a man's foot or a man's fist, and strong enough to break any hook except for the strongest, and greedy enough to eat anything, living, or dead, or putrid, that their strong jaws can master. They are vile things, and the few locals who fish the brack tell wicked tales of them down there. They call them man-eaters, and compare them to sharks. Jimmy Catfish was one of the few people who lived on the shores of Codfresh Lake. He had been born there to a fisherman and a Native American woman. Both were long dead. Jim was deformed, and the story that ran around Cape Cod was that his mother had been frightened by one of the monster catfish just before giving birth, so that's why the baby was born deformed. There was little support for one born different back in the 1960s, the time of this story. Jimmy Catfish was considered a human monstrosity, the veritable embodiment of a nightmare. He had the body of a man. A short, stocky, sinewy body. But his face was as near to being the face of a great fish as any face could be, and still have some trace of humanity. His skull sloped back so sharply that he could hardly be said to have a forehead at all. His chin slanted off right into nothing. His eyes were small and round, with shallow glazed, pale yellow pupils, and they were set wide apart in his head, and they were unblinking and staring, like fish eyes. His nose was little more than 2 slits on an oily face. His mouth was the worst of all. It was the awful and ugly mouth of a catfish, lipless, and almost inconceivably wide, stretching from side to side. Most cruel of all, when Jimmy grew up and became a man, his likeness to a fish increased, for the hair upon his face grew out into 2 tightly kinked, slender, tail-shaped clusters that drooped down either side of the mouth like the beards of a fish. He was often called simply Catfish, and he answered to it. He knew the waters and the woods of the area better than any other man there, but he mainly kept to himself, tending his vegetable garden, fishing the lake, and trapping a little. His neighbors left him to himself. Indeed, for the most part they had a superstitious fear of him. So he lived alone, with no friends or visitors. His cabin stood just at the merge of the brack and a freshwater lake. It was a shack of logs, the only human habitation for a few miles in any direction. Behind it, the thick timber marched right up to the edge of his small garden, enclosing it in thick shade except when the sun stood just overhead. He cooked his food in a primitive fashion outdoors, over a hole in the soggy earth, or upon the rusted red ruin of an old cook stove, and he drank the brown water of the fresh lake, out of a dipper made of a gourd, faring and fending for himself, a master hand at skiff and net, competent with duck gun and fish spear, yet a creature of affliction and loneliness. Part savage, almost amphibious, set apart from his fellows, silent and suspicious. In front of his cabin jutted out the trunk of a long fallen maple tree, lying half in and half out of the water, its top side made sand-colored by the sun, and worn smooth by the friction of Jimmy's bare webbed feet until it showed countless patterns of tiny scrolled lines, its underside, black and rotted, by the force of a never-ending procession of little waves. The farther end of the fallen timber reached deep water. And it was a part of Jimmy Catfish, for no matter how far his fishing and trapping might take him in the daytime, sunset would find him back there, his boat drawn up on the bank, and he on the other end of this log. From a distance men had seen him there many times, sometimes squatted as motionless as the big turtles that would crawl upon its dipping tip in his absence, sometimes erect and motionless, his misshapen form outlined against the yellow sun, the brown water, and the muddy banks. If the locals shunned Catfish by day, they feared him by night, and avoided him as a plague, dreading even the chance of a casual meeting, for there were ugly stories about Jimmy. They said that a cry which had been heard just before dusk and just after, skittering across the darkened waters, was his calling cry to the big catfish, and at his bidding, they came trooping in, and then in their company he swam in the brack on moonlight nights, diving with them, even feeding with them on whatever manner of unclean things they found rotting among the weeds and the rocks on the bottom of the waters of the eerie brack. The eerie, calling cry of Jimmy Catfish had been heard many times. That much was certain, and it was also certain that the big catfish congregated in large numbers near Jimmy's fallen log, upon which he spent the late afternoons and early evenings. This is where Jimmy Catfish lived, and this is where he is going to die. The Jameson brothers are going to kill him. And this day in late summer is to be the time of the killing. The two Jamesons, Jake and Joel, were coming in their dugout canoe to do it. This murder had been a long time in the making. The slimy Jameson brothers had to brew their hate over a slow fire for months before it reached the pitch of action. They were poor, jobless locals, poor in everything, repute and worldly goods and standing. A pair of fever-ridden squatters who lived on whiskey and tobacco when they could get it, and on fish and cornbread when they couldn't. The feud itself was of months standing, meeting Jimmy one day in the spring on the spindly scaffolding of the skiff landing at Walnut Log, and being themselves far overtaken in liquor, and with a bogus alcoholic substitute for courage, the brothers accused him, wantonly and without proof, of running their trout line and stripping it of the hooked catch. This was an unforgivable sin among Cape Cod fishermen. Seeing that he bore this accusation in silence, only eyeing them steadfastly, they had been emboldened then to slap his face, whereupon he turned and gave them both the beating of their lives, bloodying their noses and bruising their lips with hard blows against their front teeth, and finally leaving them, mauled and prone in the dirt. Straight into this green clump glided the dugout, and swung broadside against the protecting trunk of the tree, hidden from the inner side by the intervening curtains of dense growth, just as the horrid Jameson brothers had intended it to be when they scouted the masked place of waiting and included it in the scope of their plans. There had been no hitch or mishap. No one had been on the lake in the late afternoon to mark their movements, and in a little while, Jimmy Catfish would emerge from the woods. The shadows lengthened and slithered on the small ripples of the lake. The small noises of the day died out, the small noises of the coming night began to multiply. The green-bodied flies went away, and big mosquitoes with speckled gray legs came to take the places of the flies. The sleepy lake sucked at the mud banks, with small mouthing sounds, as though it found the taste of the raw mud agreeable. Bats began to flit back and forth above the tops of the trees. A pudgy muskrat, swimming with head up, was moved to sidle off briskly as he met a water snake, so fat and swollen that it looked almost like a legless lizard as it moved along the surface of the water, in a series of movements that looked like the letter S directly above the head of either of the waiting assassins. A thick swarm of biting midges hung, holding to pattern that resembled the shape of a kite. A little more time passed and Jimmy came out of the woods walking swiftly, with a sack over his shoulder. For a few seconds he stood in the clearing, then ambled slowly into his shack. By now the sun was almost down. Only the red nub of it showed above the timber line across the lake, and the shadows lay inland a long way. Out beyond, the big catfish were stirring, and the great smacking sounds, as their twisting bodies leapt clear and fell back in the water, came shoreward in a chorus. But the two brothers paid attention to nothing except the one thing upon which their hearts were set, and their nerves tensed. Joel gently shoved his gun barrels across the log, huddling the stock to his shoulder, and slipping 2 fingers caressingly back and forth upon the triggers. Jake held the narrow canoe steady by gripping a fistful of the vines that clung to the fallen tree. A little wait, and then the finish came. Jimmy Catfish emerged from the cabin door and came down the narrow footpath to the water and out upon the water on his log. He was barefooted and bareheaded. His cotton shirt was open down the front to show his neck and chest. His dungarees were held about his waist by a twisted tow rope. His broad feet, with their webbed toes spread out, gripped the polished curve of the log as he moved along its swaying, dipping surface until he came to its outer end, and stood there erect, his chest filling, his chinless face lifted up. And though he was considered a freak, a subhuman to many people, Jimmy Catfish had the look of a master and of dominion in his poise. And then his eye caught what another's eyes might have missed. The round, twin ends of the gun barrels, the fixed gleam of Joel's eyes, aimed at him. In that swift passage of time, too swift almost to be measured by seconds, realization flashed all through him, and he threw his head still higher and opened wide his lipless slit of a mouth. And out across the lake he sent skittering and rolling his cry. And in his cry was the eerie combing sound that the catfishes make by manipulating the ridges of their spines. It's similar to the sound made when a person runs a finger up and down the teeth of a comb. And in Jimmy's cry too was a farewell, and a defiance, and an appeal to his friends, the sharp-toothed and dangerous catfish. heavy roar of the duck gun overpowered all the other sounds on the lake. At 20 yards, the double charge from the Jameson shotgun tore the throat out of Jimmy Catfish. He came down, face forward, upon the log and clung there, his trunk twisting in spasms, his legs twitching and kicking like the legs of a speared frog, his shoulders hunching and lifting spasmodically as the life ran out of him, all in one swift coursing flow. His head canted up between the heaving shoulders, his eyes looked directly into the staring face of his murderer, and then the blood came out of his mouth, and Jimmy Catfish, in death, still as much fish as man, slid, flopping headfirst, off the end of the log, and sank, face downward slowly, his limbs all extended out. One after another, a string of big bubbles came up to burst in the middle of a widening reddish stain on the gray water. The brothers watched this, held by the horror of the thing they had done, and the cranky dugout, having been tipped far over by the recoil of the gun, water steadily. And then there was a sudden strike from below, upon its careening bottom, and it tipped over, and the murdering Jameson brothers were dumped into the lake. The shore was only 20 feet away, the trunk of the uprooted tree was just 5 feet away. Joel, still holding on tightly to his shotgun, made for the log, gaining it with one stroke. He threw his free arm over it and clung there, treading water and looking for his brother. But then, something gripped him. Some great, sinewy, unseen thing gripped him fast by the thigh, crushing down on his flesh. Joel Jameson uttered no cry, but his eyes popped out, and his mouth set itself in a square shape of agony, and his fingers gripped into the bark of the tree like grappling hooks. Something was pulling him under the water, down and down by steady jerks, not rapidly, but steadily. As he slid downward, his fingernails tore 4 little white strips in the tree bark. His mouth went under, next his popping eyes, then his hair, which was standing on end. And finally his clawing, clutching hand. And that was the end of the craven killer, Joel Jameson. But Jake's fate was harder still, for he lived longer. Long enough to see Joel's finish. He saw it through the water that ran down his face, and with a great surge of his whole body, he literally flung himself across the log and jerked his legs up high into the air to save them. He flung himself too far though, for his face and chest hit the water on the far side. And out of this water rose the head of a great catfish, with the lake slime of years on its flat, black head, its whiskers bristling, its fixed eyes lit up like a campfire, its bony jaws closed and clamped onto the front of Jake's flannel shirt. His hand struck out wildly and was speared on a poison fin, and, unlike Joel, he went from sight with a great yell, and a whirling and turning of the water that made the cornstalks circle on the edges of a small whirlpool. But the whirlpool soon thinned away into widening rings of ripples, and the cornstalks quit circling and became still again, and only the multiplying night noises made any sound around Jimmy Catfish's log. The bodies of all three came ashore the following morning near the same place. Except for the gaping gunshot in his neck, Jimmy Catfish's body was unmarked. But the bodies of the evil brothers, Joel and Jake, were so marred and mauled that the locals buried them together on the shore near Jimmy's log, without ever knowing which corpse might be Jake and which might be Joel.
And so closes Jimmy Catfish, a tale of an unfortunate boy who looked more like a fish than a man. The story has a very sad ending, with Jimmy's body washing up on the shore, unmarked by his friends, the catfish. But the bodies of his killers, Joel and Jake, were torn to shreds by the huge catfish of Codfresh Lake. As I said, that was the end of Jimmy Catfish. But there is much more to be said about him, and our author Bill Russo relates those stories in a prequel book, which you can read for free on Smashwords. The book is called Jimmy Catfish: The Beginning and the End. Here's a description of the book read by Marilyn, from the review site, White3215.
Forced into retirement, following a stormy career as captain of the last three-masted schooner, still sailing the Atlantic in the 1950s, Francisco Da Silva hopes for a better life on Cape Cod with his new bride, a Native American woman. They settle into a cozy cottage alongside Codfresh Lake, an eerie body of water, compounded of 3 separate but vastly different sections, one of which contains giant, sharp-toothed catfish with poison fins. that threaten his life, and that of his pregnant wife. Jimmy Catfish is at once an epic adventure and an examination of ill fate, peeling away the layers of a man's resolve, decency, and will to battle both his personal and physical demons.
Thanks, Marilyn. If you wish to read the book for free, Google Jimmy Catfish, the beginning and the end, smash words, and you'll be directed to the site. That's it for episode 9 of season 2 of Short Story Theatre. If you enjoy the offerings from the little theatre in the alley, just off Main Street, please share it, and like it on Facebook and other sites. Speaking for Gino Roselli, who told you the story, and for our producer, writer, and director, Bill Russo, this is your host Basil Nightingale, saying thanks for coming to the theatre, and please come back again real soon. Won't you?